This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there and welcome to the show. It's a Tuesday, May 14th to be exact, and I have Eric Peters from Eric Peters Autos joining me as we do each Tuesday. Eric, how are you today?
Well, I guess I'm okay, but I'm getting ready to call Saul. Remember Better Call Saul?
Oh.
I think it's time for us to lawyer up.
And he's actually probably the only lawyer I would trust in times like these. You were telling me before we went on the air about, I knew that Trump had a big, well-attended rally in New Jersey, but I did not hear some of the specific comments that were made, and there was one in particular regarding anti-Semitism that I find really alarming. Talk to me about what he said.
Well, he gave a quasi-Hitlerian speech. You know, I know you don't want to bring up Hitler unless it's really, really necessary, but I think in this case it was. He essentially urged the death penalty, the killing of anybody who is, quote-unquote, an anti-Semite. And it's an example of Trump's Tulsa Doom-like hold on people. And what do I mean by that? I have a red hat friend, and you know his immediate reaction was, well, he was talking about the people who committed the assault back in October. But then why didn't he say that? Why didn't he say, we will not tolerate people who commit murderous acts? Instead, he used that anti-Semitism term, which, as you and I and any other thinking hat person know, has become equated with any questioning whatsoever, let alone opposition to whatever the government of Israel does, which is an entirely different thing than being against Jewish people for being Jewish.
Yeah, it's like the unspecified predicate of hate. Well, this person is guilty of hate. What does that mean? Anti-Semitism is a very malleable term in the mouths of those who are speaking it, so it can be used to anybody who criticizes Israel's government, anybody who disagrees with a particular performer who happens to be Jewish, whatever it may be. You could be tarred and feathered with that label, and now we're to the death penalty phase? Do tell.
Yeah, and particularly in the context of the last 2 weeks, because literally the Congress of the United States just passed legislation that effectively criminalizes criticism of the state of Israel, equating it with being, quote-unquote, anti-Semitic.
You know, Trump's electoral mojo is growing, as James Howard Kunstler would say, but I'm not in a celebratory mood when I think about there are some very serious problems, and I think you addressed this in your Unrepentant Man column. Yep. This is not to say that, Biden's a better alternative, but Trump brings some really unwelcome baggage with him.
No, it's appalling. There's an old joke. It's not particularly family-friendly, but bear with me a minute. So a guy is captured by savages in the jungle, and he's offered the choice of death or Katanga. And Katanga means rape by the entire community of the savages. So naturally he chooses death. And the chieftain says, death by Katanga. That's the kind of choice I think that we're facing this fall.
No, that's accurate. I don't know.
And the thing I wrote the other day, which it just happened that, Trump gave this speech that dovetailed what I had written. But I'm very profoundly troubled by the fact that he has yet to acknowledge that he made mistakes with regard to his handling of the COVID pandemic, and in particular his warp speeding of these drugs, which he continues to defend, continues to call beautiful. Well, doesn't the question arise then, what happens the next time? Let's say he's elected, there's another pandemic. What reason, what confidence can we have that he wouldn't push new drugs on us because he hasn't yet to acknowledge that it was wrong to have done it the first time around?
That's a fair point. And this is one of the things I find really troubling. I'm going to talk about this later on in the hour. In my home state of Idaho, there is a life and death battle starting to rage between the establishment and people who actually have, I'm going to use the term conservative values, but what I really mean are traditional values where they value limited government, personal freedom, fiscal accountability on the part of those who represent them. Those are the people portrayed as extremists, while the people who ordered the lockdowns and upheld the lockdowns and arrested moms for going to the park and so forth, they're the ones running but we're the common sense Republicans, and they are desperate to hang on to power because people have started to wake up to just how badly we were abused.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, why it's so absolutely important to hold the proverbial feet to the fire of people like Trump and anybody else who presents themselves as a putative leader of conservative politics.
Yep, the actions have to be more powerful than the words, and Trump is speaking the right words. They're music to some people's ears, but But yeah, without some repentance or at least some acknowledgement that, look, we got this wrong, that's not going to happen again, that's a very dangerous place to go. And I realize our alternative isn't any better under Joe Biden or whoever ends up actually on the Democratic ticket.
It's exasperating, isn't it? You know, Trump might be hypothetically marginally better in this way or that way, but as I read it, he seems to be every bit as authoritarian as Biden, just in a slightly different direction.
Yeah. So do you want, do you want Republican flavored statism or do you prefer Democrat flavored statism? Take your choice. Shot in the head or really shot in the stomach?
Awakening. That's the awakening that's dawning. You know, it's becoming increasingly clear to me and a lot of other people that there isn't any choice. What there is the appearance of choice in order to create the fraudulent idea that we've consented to this. You know, there is no real meaningful choice. There's no note, none of the above. Wouldn't that be great if on the presidential ballot you could vote for none of the above? I think if we had that category, probably none of the above would win in a landslide.
Yeah, I believe so. And here's the part that really troubles me, Eric. It's the fact that I find myself caught up in this occasionally. I really don't need someone to govern me. I'm not clamoring for, I want them to govern me. I'd rather govern myself. But it seems like the mindset among a lot of Americans is we have to choose somebody to govern us, which implies that we're not capable of governing ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. But I think another element to it is, and at least I'm speaking for myself, and maybe you'll agree with me on this, the only reason that I even consider voting is kind of in a defensive way, in that, you know, well, will this person leave me alone somewhat relative to the other person? You know, it's a way to try to ward off the worst. It's not a vote of affirmation. It's kind of a negation, if you will.
No, I get it. We're trying to slow the roll of Leviathan.
Yep.
And unfortunately, both parties seem very dedicated. One is going at the posted speed limit. The other one has the pedal to the floor.
Yep, exactly. And this business with the anti-Semitism stuff is really getting out of control. It's become as much of a dogma and a religion as, you know, wearing your mask was, you know, during the height of the craziness of the so-called pandemic. You know, anybody who questions anything having to do with Israel is looked upon in the same way that people who questioned the wearing of the masks was back then.
Yeah, I know that it's not good to go around vindictive and it's not good to go carrying a grudge through life. But I'm concerned that if I don't at least remind people just how badly we were abused over the last 4 years, we're going to forget. And we're going to let those people who are still in power, you know, make those same kind of decisions and then wring our hands. Oh, what can I do? They said I have to. It's policy, you know, or procedure.
Well, sure. It's that the abuse is ongoing. You know, getting back to Trump, it's not so much that he made mistakes, that he warp speeded the drugs, that he helped to push the drugs, all of that. It's that he hasn't owned up to what he did. It's that these people who were vicious to people like you and I and other people who questioned have yet to say, you know, I'm really sorry. I feel bad. I did something awful. I won't ever do it again. If they would do that, I'd be willing to give them some grace and some forgiveness. But until they do, I absolutely will not. I will indeed hold a grudge, and I will be kept on my guard.
Yeah, I listen to a podcaster by the name of Andy Frisella from time to time, and I love Andy. He has a very foul mouth, but he speaks a great deal of truth. So I just dodge the swear words as best I can because the man is a straight up truth teller. And he talked about how during the pandemic, especially when the whole masking mandates was being enforced, not so much by government, but by all the ruthless Karens out there. He says, I just flat out stopped going into public because I knew if somebody got into my face, I was going to knock him into the middle of next week. And he goes, I don't want to catch an assault charge just because somebody else couldn't help bossing me around.
Me too. I was all geared up for that. I was ready. I was on a hair trigger, and I absolutely would have. And I'm grateful that situation never did arise. But I was fully prepared to, as they say in the mob, go to the mattresses over it. I was not going to put up with it.
Well, and I think the most disturbing thing that we learned, we know government and people within government, whether they be politicians or just functionaries, will take things to ridiculous ends. I was not prepared mentally for how many of my fellow citizens would click their heels and dutifully obey because they felt like that was, someone in authority has spoken, I must do so or I'm not a good person.
Yeah, nor I didn't realize the extent of the rot, and it's still out there. Now it's just been shifted to different things. We saw it with Kyiv, stand with Kyiv, and now stand with Israel, and now stand against anti-Semites. it seems like the entire mass of the population is ready to stand with whatever they're told to stand for. And if you don't stand along with them, then the finger of heresy gets pointed at you, and it's off with their heads.
Yep. And I guess that, I'm not saying, well, so what we have to do is rail harder against those people. I'm just suggesting if you are truly a good person, you are doing much more good by living your life as a decent individual than the people who are out there railing against the perceived unrighteousness of this person or that person, usually over differences of opinion.
Yep. Well, I think we should go back to the counsel given us many years ago by the Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which is hold on to the truth. Don't let lies govern you.
Here.
On an individual level and otherwise. Don't put up with being lied to.
Hold
Don't
that thought. Hold that thought. We'll be right back.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. Eric Peters from Eric Peters Autos is my guest. There is a link to his website in the show notes at thebryanhydeshow.com. Eric, as we went to break, you were quoting the great Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who by the way, he is one of the moral authorities that I turn to for how do you live in times of tyranny, since he was a guy who lived through it and experienced it firsthand. And you were mentioning he was very adamant about if you want to really stand up for what's right, you've got to commit yourself to not participating in the lie.
Right. To be a beacon of sanity really is another way to look at it, by not pretending that falsehood is true, by just hewing to what you know to be correct and right, irrespective of the situation that you find yourself in. And don't be complicit with it, because these liars depend on our silent complicity. We'll just go along to get along. We don't want any trouble. And like Ned Beatty said at Deliverance.
Right. And what did it get him? Squeal like a pig.
Right. Right.
But a lot of people, that sounds good. And they're like, sure, I'll be strong. I'll be firm and I'll stand up for the truth. But when push comes to shove, they realize that there is punishment. If you don't participate in the lie that everybody else is participating in, masking would be a good example of this. That punishment can range from shame to men with badges and guns, coming and taking you away because you refuse to take part.
But what a light punishment right now, especially during the pandemic. Solzhenitsyn was in prison. He put him in a gulag, I think, for 5 or 8 years or something. He was in a Soviet gulag. That's what he was willing to endure. Are we willing to just endure not being allowed to go into a store to do shopping? I mean, it's really sad, the timorousness and poltroonishness of so many Americans today who are unwilling to endure an inconvenience for the sake of opposing a tyranny.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean you have to be an overbearing, guerrilla type, intimidation person to say no. It will be uncomfortable, though. I can tell you from firsthand experience. I know you've experienced it too. Places that you have patronized long term, you ended up having to sever that relationship because they would not budge, and the choice was, well, if you're not going to, do what we say, then out with you, unclean man.
But you know what? That's curative. That's healthy. Instead of parents who let their kids be exposed to drag queen story hour. You don't have to go there and with a baseball bat and kick in people's heads and stuff. You just take your kid out of that and say, this is not acceptable. I don't want my kid exposed to that. And that's the end of it.
Yep. It's all I can say is, to have a conscience that's at peace is worth a lot more than people think. So just getting along and avoiding conflict or going along and not attracting negative attention, yeah, that gives you some temporary relief. But the price is you end up hating yourself down the road because you realize you've compromised yourself.
Yeah, you degraded yourself. You're a coward at the end of the day because you went along with it and you were wrong to do that. And that does gnaw at you if you have any self-respect.
Hear, hear. Let's talk for a moment about anything automotive that's on your radar screen. I know you not only test drive and write up about the various vehicles out there, but anything to report. I think I saw an article that you had written about losing $100,000 per sale on EVs.
Oh yeah, this is just again the ongoing saga of this electric vehicle boondoggle, one of the many boondoggles that we're dealing with in this country now. Ford announced that it is losing $100,000 on the sale of each EV. that it's quote unquote selling. Now, you would think that would induce Ford to say, you know what, maybe it's time to stop trying to sell vehicles that we're losing $100,000 on. But no, they're just curtailing production a little bit. And, there's a sad element to this, but there's also a sinister element to it, which you and I have touched on before. And here's what I think it is. In order for Ford to sell that vehicle at a profit, okay, the base price of it is like $55,000. I'm talking about the F-150 Lightning, plus the $100,000 loss to make it. They'd have to sell it at around $160,000. And maybe their thinking is that down the road, what we'll be doing is selling vehicles that cost $160,000 to the very handful of party apparat elites who will be able to afford a vehicle. And I do think ultimately that is where this thing is headed.
Wow. Is there another bailout in the offing? Because it sure seems like somebody is setting up a great bailout. We can afford it, right? Well, it's a few trillion here and there.
I wish it were only a bailout. What I foresee happening is what Solzhenitsyn and other people who had the misfortune to live in the Soviet Union had to deal with, which was the merger of state and corporate power for the benefit of the people who control both of those things. So you'll end up with a so-called auto industry that caters to the elites. You remember how in the old Soviet Union they had special supermarkets for the party people, but then everybody else got to go to the regular supermarket where there was no food? That's the kind of scenario that they're trying to erect in this country now.
Wow. Yep. I mean, it's conversations like this that now I start to understand why tending to my chickens is actually one of the most fulfilling activities of my day. I mean, I'm out here to publish truth and, speak the truth as best I understand it. But where I really feel at peace is when I'm out there taking care of my girls and collecting their eggs and realizing that, well, here's just one more aspect where I'm not dependent on someone in authority to keep me fed and happy.
Yeah, we're learning to take care of ourselves as well as our animals. And if we have a little time, I'd like to talk about an experience that I had dealing with a vet lately.
Tell me about it.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Well, okay, so I've got, as you know, we have a dog, and he's not quite 2 years old, and he picked up some fleas. So I went to the vet to get some flea meds. And they told me that they couldn't give me the flea meds because they're now a prescription med. And in order for them to prescribe the med, I have to bring the dog in to get essentially an inspection. I have to get him a wellness check, for which they'll charge me $80 on top of the cost of the flea meds. There's nothing wrong with the dog. He needs an inspection like my cars need a state inspection, the way they gouge you for that. So I'm done with them. I went ahead and found the meds on my own furtively. But they become as mercenary and as callous as the white coats that we on two legs have had to deal with.
Wow. I'm sure there's great wisdom, but they're protecting us, right? Right? Keeping us safe?
That's the argument. That is the argument. We've got to make sure everything's okay with your animal. Meanwhile, what they want to do is push drugs on the animal, the vaccines, which are even worse than the ones that they're pushing on people because, my God, we know what kind of protocols for safety are in place for the drugs they're pushing on us. Can you imagine what minimal, if any, protocols are in place for the drugs they're pushing on the animals?
All I know is I am doing everything in my power to create greater medical self-sufficiency. And apparently that will extend to, my dogs, my chickens, and any other livestock too. I've told you before, I've got a good friend who makes regular trips down to Tijuana to pick up pharmaceutical things for those who want to stock up on it. And this is perfectly legal. You have to operate within certain limits, but everybody needs a friend like that who's willing to go to the mat for them.
The really healthy thing is we're getting back to the mindset that built this country, that of self-sufficiency and self-thought and self-leadership. Figuring out what the situation is and how it's best to be dealt with by you without sitting there passively with your hands in your lap, waiting for some expert or authority figure to tell you what you should do.
Right. And I think unlearning that concept that truth is not something handed to you by somebody in authority, that's a hard thing for a lot of people. In fact, if they question authority too much and realize, hey, these guys are as full of it as a Christmas goose, then it kind of shakes your worldview because it's, well, what else do I need to question? What else may be just kind of a false front that looks like it has substance but really doesn't?
Initially, it's very unnerving because you assume that these experts and authorities are trustworthy and fundamentally that they are trying to do the right thing. And then when you start to unravel it and realize, in fact, not only are they not competent, but they're malicious on top of that, yeah, it's very unsettling because you may have based your life in a great many ways on that trust, which has been greatly abused.
Yep. I guess it really comes back to the whole idea of you got to find the courage to stand on your own feet, like Solzhenitsyn would urge you, and resolve, I will not participate in the lie.
Yep.
Eric,
absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time. I always feel encouraged after our conversations, and I appreciate your influence.
Well, thank you. That plus a cup of coffee will get us through the day.
I agree. Thanks again. I look forward to our conversation next week.
Bet.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. As I mentioned with Eric Peters, I really struggle to get past what was done to us just 3 short years ago. The intensity of, the push for you will wear the mask, you will take the vaccine, and all of the coercion. And I guess what sets me off is there are people today who now realize, okay, well, that was wrong, or the masks didn't really stop transmission of the disease, nor did the vaccine or anything like that. I still don't feel like the people who were responsible for shutting down society, for having mothers arrested for taking their kids to the park, or for arresting churchgoers for singing in their church parking lot, I don't think the people in power actually ever paid a price. I certainly haven't seen a big mea culpa from any of them. And like we talked about with Eric, Trump is one of the biggest offenders on this. He's still, it's a beautiful thing, those vaccines. And that's a problem. And so I don't want to sound too vindictive, like, boy, we got to, I'll feel better when I see you swinging in the breeze. That kind of vengeance I don't think is productive. But at the same time, I see such a concerted push right now by the very people who either instituted these policies or just clicked their heels and went along with them without question. Man, they are desperate to hang on to power, which makes me think they would do it again. And that sets up a head-on collision that is not going to be pretty because, I don't know about you, my line in the sand is so deep, it is for all intents and purposes a trench at this point. I'm not only not going to comply, I am going to encourage every person who will hear me not to comply as well. That's how badly they have betrayed our trust. And I try to think, well, how can you persuade people that this is a point of view that's valid as opposed to just a guy who's, venting his spleen and, trying to blow off some steam here? Well, once again, I can turn to my friend Paul Rosenberg and his ability to distill things like this down into the bare essentials, the principles that are at stake. I've got an article from him from a couple of days back on the weaponization of medicine. And I'm not telling you have to agree with him. You don't have to agree with me either. But I think he makes a very plausible case about how mainstream medicine was entirely co-opted by power seekers and opportunists within government to use that COVID pandemic to essentially put a boot right on the back of our necks. Here's how Paul puts it. He says, whether or not we can express it clearly or even perceive it clearly, I think nearly every adult grasps that medicine is now being used as a weapon. Now, he says, I'm not a doctor, but I've been surrounded by medical professionals since my youth, beginning with my mom, who was not only an RN, but a head nurse at 2 different hospitals. And he says, I've also been involved with science for a long time. So he says, I'll be brief, but I have just 5 primary points. We've been losing science and we've been losing medicine, and he says that is flatly unacceptable. And these are some of the reasons he gives, okay? Number 1, science is not consensus. 10, 100, or even 1 million people all draped up in lab coats and saying the same thing does not make it so. In fact, it matters not at all. It's nothing but theater, and it's anti-science. He says all science is a process of testing ideas. It's not an organization. It's not based upon authority. In fact, it's inherently anti-authority. and it is very certainly not allied with power. All that matters in science are verifiable results. Number 2, he says, medicine stands apart from and above politics. Medicine is the application of science to the furtherance of human health. Politics is the use of persuasion and power to rule masses of humans. Those are two fully separate disciplines. So to place politics over medicine is to subjugate and degrade medicine. It's a path backwards into darkness. And he says, I'll leave the details on this point to working medical practitioners who can provide them with far greater specificity than I can, provided they're not too frightened to do so. He has a good point. Number 3, peer review no longer means much. Again, he says, I'm not going to go into great detail, but peer review has been captured by academic hierarchies and very often separated from science proper. It has become a tool of institutional power wielded by academics who have sold out science for the favors of power and politics. Now, at one time, peer review referred to the honest replication of experiments, but that time is largely past. This kind of goes back to what I was talking about yesterday of, who paid for this science? Who paid for this research? Because there's a better than average or better than not chance here that whoever paid the bill for that research is getting the results that they wanted because they're the one cutting the check. I mean, who's going to bite the hand that feeds them, right? Number 4, Paul says science and medicine have nothing to do with social pressure. Once science and medicine are mixed with social pressure, they're no longer science or medicine. At that point, they're instruments of manipulation and thuggery. Nothing more. And number 5, he says, if you don't read multiple scientific papers, especially from rebels and castouts, you simply don't know. You can pretend you know, of course, and you can be sure that agents of the state, or the status quo rather, will provide you with passable reasons to repeat their slogans, but you won't actually know. He says what you see on TV is propaganda. What you see on Facebook and YouTube is pre-censored. So if you really want to know, you'll have to find the scientific papers that address your question. You'll need papers that are rejected by televised authorities. And if you don't, all you're going to have are pre-censored conclusions, the underlying facts of which may or may not be reliable. So at this point, if you don't include conspiracy theory research, you're more or less stuck with Orwell's Ministry of Truth. Sad but true. I think these are really on-target observations, by the way, on the part of Paul Rosenberg. Now, he says the problem is emotional weakness. It's not intellectual strength, it's emotional strength that's led us to this place. And it's not that people are stupid, it's that they just don't have the strength to face unauthorized truth. He says, having been trained in submission to authority, then to speak against an authority, that's terrifying. So people find ways to ignore truth which has no backing but itself, and to sanctify authority which is backed by everything from shame to guns. There's also the fear of appearing stupid or of being publicly exposed as stupid. That can be overwhelming. And important people tearing up anyone not in lockstep with them, that makes defiance seem just a little too expensive. Nobody really wants to be on the receiving end of that. Next, he talks about how power being wrong calls too much into question. Think about what he's saying here. If the high and mighty can be publicly wrong, repeatedly and adamantly, well, then what can't be called into question? And if everything can be questioned, well, then that means you are facing the world alone. And finally, once people act upon fear, turning the other way sets them up for attacks. Many types of attacks. I can't see any flaw in his reasoning here. Paul says none of these things have any connection to truth, only to power and intimidation. And that is anti-science, no matter how much it masquerades as science. This is really something. By the way, in the comments on this article, you'll find some really excellent stuff. That one of the people here had offered a link to a book about modern medicine, the New World Religion, how beliefs secretly influence medical dogmas and practices. And these are some of the things that they talk about in here. Physicians have taken the place of priests. Vaccination plays the same initiatory role as baptism, and it's accompanied by the same threats and fears. The search for health has replaced their quest for salvation. The fight against disease has replaced the fight against sin. Eradication of viruses has taken the place of exorcising demons. The hope of physical immortality, cloning, genetic engineering, has been substituted for the hope of eternal life. Pills have replaced the sacrament of bread and wine. Donations to cancer research take precedence over donations to the church. A hypothetical universal vaccine could save humanity from all its illnesses, as the Savior has saved the world from all its sins. The medical power has become government's ally, as was the Catholic Church in the past. Charlatans are persecuted today as heretics were yesterday. Dogmatism rules out promising alternative medical theories. And the same absence of individual responsibility is now found in medicine as previously in the Christian religion. Patients are alienated from their bodies just as sinners used to be alienated from their souls. Now, maybe that's not a 100%, pure translation back and forth there, but there's a lot of those that really ring true. And especially when you consider the way that people were treated. I mean, look, again, I don't mean to rub salt in old wounds here, but you do recall that there were people who were absolutely okay with you find the unvaccinated. You confine them to their homes. They should be under house arrest. Their children should be taken away from them. I saw at least one survey in which 50% of the respondents said, yes, unvaccinated people should be in camps. And people wonder, how did the people of Weimar Germany go so far off track? Well, we just saw a very modern version of that just about 3 years ago.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. Okay, there's a lot to cover in this last segment, but here we go. I have been unnerved by how personal and nasty the May 21st primary election is becoming in my home state of Idaho. It's ugly, and there is subterfuge and untruth and personal attacks like I have never seen before. And I steer pretty clear of politics for the most part. This is mudslinging at its finest. And I'm appealing to another couple of Bryans. Apparently this is the year of the Bryan, because it seems like most of the commentators out here share this name. Brian Almon has a great explanation of why things are so intense. He basically says that this is for all the marbles. The establishment knows its grip on power is loosening because people have woke up. They've recognized that they were being abused by the people in power, especially those common sense conservatives who actually govern like hardcore progressive Democrats. So he has a great explanation there. I've got a link to that. Brian Parsons, who is another great writer here in the Gem State, explains how principled voters are finally challenging those unchallenged voices of the political machine. And, of course, it's put the political machine into panic. Two great articles that I hope you'll take a moment to check out. Very, very worth your while. Also, this was kind of an interesting one. I don't encourage people to go out there and pick an argument. Sometimes, though, the argument is going to find you. And this is an article, someone writing under the pseudonym Nordog, the most satisfying way to talk to a leftist. Now, I'm going to substitute the word ideologue for leftist, because there are ideologues on the right who are likewise very dogmatic and, looking for a chance to argue. But Nordog says, do you remember the days when you could have a conversation with a friend, and if you disagreed, well, you knew it was because he didn't have all the facts, so you politely filled in the holes of his knowledge and expected him to agree with you wholeheartedly. And in the rare event that your wisdom didn't sway his original opinion, well, then you both ordered another drink and you started talking about the weather. Well, those days are gone. Today, particularly if you swerve marginally toward reality, you need to be careful in what's become a dangerous minefield, or as I like to think of it, a mind field. So he says, a leftist friend called me today, or regaled me today, with the reasons Trump should be in jail and how his criminal acts of unlawful activities and concealing damaging information from voters nearly a decade ago were reprehensible, all leading to the conclusion that the jailhouse key should be discarded forever. Now, how does a sensitive person respond to such a diatribe? You can't just come right out and ask them, where'd you get your information? That's too in your face for today's ideologue. They will immediately assume you're on the other side, and from that moment on, they start hyperventilating because they know you're a bad person, irredeemable, ignorable, and cancelable. So instead, he suggests a safer route, and it's a lot of fun. And actually, I kind of agree with this approach, although I think if you're doing this for the purposes of tormenting somebody, you're not doing it for a good reason. But he says, feign ignorance and surprise that they're so well informed. And I have to admit, think of how this simple question would disarm somebody who's going off on a good rant. Just stop them and say, wow, how do you know so much? Now, the real trick here is not to let them know that you know more than they do, right? You're not trying to out-bluff them or blow up a bigger balloon than theirs. It may be difficult, but complete silence seems to encourage them. So it's a monumental requirement, but studied strategies can make the results worthwhile. So say somebody's going off on Trump. You could ask, well, so what did he do? Right? In other words, make them fill in the details. And often it'll be a response like, well, it's the man. He should be in jail for his lies and what he's done to the people. I can hear my sister, he's a racist, an unrepentant racist. Wow. Well, tell me more. Where did you find all this out? And you can also throw in the occasional, you are so clever. Now, the person writing this, again, under the pseudonym of Nordog, says it's always good to agree with no information idiots. They like it that way, and attempting to remedy their ignorance could induce an aneurysm on either side. So technically, you're applying a symptom of mental illness called mirroring. But since you're doing it ironically, it's okay. You agree with everything they say, playing it back to them, confirming their confirmation bias. It's an Ouroboros. And when you get tired of that, mention the weather. If, as seems inevitable, it starts to slide toward climate change, you know what to do. Wow, how do you know so much? See, I'm not quite ready to take it to the point where, yes, now I'm just toying with them, but I do think that's a good way to disarm somebody who is intent on, I'm here to set you straight. Just ask them, wow, how did you learn all this? And there is a chance when they start coming up short on, actual facts or coming up short on actual examples of what it is they're claiming, the light may start to come on, but you don't need to be vindictive. Like, aha, gotcha. You can just be, sounds like I may need to look into that more. Maybe that bears a little further research. Notice you're not accusing them of being stupid. You're just pointing out that, there seems to be some facts in question here. Maybe we should take a closer look. I hope that makes sense. I don't think it's right to toy with people, but I do think that this is a pretty deft way of sidestepping someone who is intent on a head-on ideological collision. All right. Last article here. This is from Lenore Skenazy. Always a good read. The stealth reason college kids are so miserable. She says the Wall Street Journal reports today's college students are so lonely, sad, and socially anxious that they grab their dining hall food to go, preferring to eat in their rooms. That really is sad. Time spent in dining halls is down 40% according to Degree Analytics. That's a company measuring students' time spent and where they spend it on campus. Attendance at sporting events, clubs, even dorm meetings is down too. In fact, the Wall Street Journal quotes one residential advisor who said several students asked to attend her meeting by Zoom, even though they were just down the hall. And the story documents classroom changes too, not just at the fancy colleges. The changes include more students handing in half-finished assignments. These same students are then shocked when they get failing grades. Look, I tried, they tell their professors. Where's my participation trophy? So Lenore Skenazy says props to reporter Douglas Belkin and assistant Harry Carr for gleaning so many granular examples of a generation that seems to have arrived on campus undercooked. The authors found that at Wesleyan University, student government meetings used to begin with a walk around campus. Today they take a walk, but they hold on to a shared rope, preschool style. It's no surprise that mental health on campus is reportedly decreasing. 1 in 7 students has considered suicide this past year. That's according to a Healthy Mind study cited by the Journal. In fact, so many students are demanding therapy that hundreds of colleges have contracted with a telehealth company that promises to find students a therapist within 5 minutes of their call. Experts are debating the cause of all this misery, and there are plenty of potential culprits. COVID-19 closures, political extremism, even the advent of the like button. But could one unnoticed factor be that this generation spent so little time unsupervised as kids? Ooh, now that's a real good question. A recent University of Michigan study found that a majority of parents with kids ages 9 to 11 will not let them walk to a friend's house, play at the park with a friend, or trick or treat unchaperoned. Only half will let their kids go to another aisle at the store by themselves. Lenore Skenazy says it's easy to see how a generation never allowed to play, walk around the neighborhood, or even drift over to the dairy section without anxious adults watching over and assisting them might just be unprepared for the real world or even eating in the dining hall. And what about the fact that most college kids today grew up with cell phones? Now, she says, I'm not talking about TikTok. I'm talking about the fact that nowadays when a kid's bike chain falls off, they can instantly call dad to come fix it. It's the same thing with their grades. Teachers tell me kids are texting their parents from the school bathroom, and then the parents turn around and call the school. She says when kids play unsupervised with other kids of different ages, they learn important skills: creativity, communication, compromise, compassion, and leadership. When they successfully complete tasks on their own, they understand they are helpful, capable, and resourceful, not babies. When young people miss out on those experiences as kids, it's no surprise they'd arrive on campus socially awkward, or afraid rather, and maybe even disliking themselves for being so unformed. Her point is simply this: until we give kids back some independence to run around and play, they will arrive on campus unprepared, clinging to the rope like a toddler, because that's how they've been treated all their lives. Man, I think about it and I think, my kids did not enjoy the same kind of freedom that I did. And yes, I was not so much a helicopter parent, but I was definitely more restrictive than my own parents were. The thought of my kids taking off on their bikes, and just going and exploring, the neighborhood for the day, that's probably not something I would have been completely comfortable with. I don't know why my parents were. maybe they wanted to get rid of me. I can't tell. No, I think you see the point, though. Giving kids that opportunity to have time to be creative, to solve problems, to learn that they can do things, that's a blessing. And it's one we ought to let them enjoy a little more often.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.